Hi everyone. Recently, I was asked a question in the comments of my very first video, my channel introduction, and it touched on the idea of modern Origipop. That is, a song that fits into this original popular music genre, but made more recently. Specifically, the commenter asked, among other things, what I thought of Icelandic singer-songwriter Laufey, and if I considered her Origipop. Now, when I read that, my first thought was, who the heck is Laufey? Sorry, I'm a guy who likes movies and music from 100 years ago, and I've never really been into modern pop culture at all. So, I didn't know who Laufey was, but I was intrigued by the idea of the question, and it touched on some of the ideas I had when I was thinking about starting this channel and trying to create a name for a genre of music that hasn't really had one for a long time. So today I want to talk a bit more about this idea, look at Laufey and other modern artists that create Origipop style songs, and answer the question, can there be modern Origipop? Now, to start off, I want to briefly go over how I define original popular music. I actually have a whole video on this topic called What is Original Popular Music? But essentially, I define it as the music that was written between 1844 and 1964 that wasn't traditional/folk music, wasn't classical/art music, and from the 1940s onward, as new styles started emerging, was music that retained a few key elements of the earlier popular music traditions. Historically, this era was the beginnings of both this type of music and of the term popular music. Therefore, this music was the original popular music. Now, let's briefly break down the different elements of that definition I just gave. Popular music was not folk or traditional music because folk music generally had unknown composers and was passed along orally to smaller local audiences. Original popular music, instead, had known composers who wrote and sold these songs through the medium of published sheet music as a way to make money. Popular music was also differentiated from art or classical music, as classical music was generally disseminated through live performances and was more complex musically. Original popular music, on the other hand, usually made its way to the public by way of sheet music initially, then records, and was generally shorter, simpler, and more easily reproducible in the home than classical music. Original popular music is also different than many of the newer styles that began to emerge in the 1940s and 50s, such as country, contemporary folk, and rock and roll, as well as modern music made today. But the differentiation of these styles is a bit more difficult to determine, as these newer styles all also meet the two previous criteria I mentioned, which separates them from traditional folk and classical music as well. Essentially, original popular music has a big emphasis and focus on clear, simple, and easily reproducible melodies that follow a few standard forms and utilize clever lyrics. The best Origipop songs have a melody that is easily remembered and can be played on the piano or even just whistled after hearing it maybe only once. And while there are great performances of Origipop songs by fantastic artists like Judy Garland, Frank Sinatra, and Ella Fitzgerald, Origipop songs are less about a specific performance of the song. It's not as much about what a singer brings to it, because traditionally so many were designed to be able to be sung at home by the general public. The song itself, as originally written, has to hold up beyond what any one singer can bring to it. There's a few other characteristics that I talk about in the other video, but that's essentially it. Now, if that seemed a little vague and not very technical, there's actually a good reason for that. See, when I created this channel, I decided purposefully to not have a strong emphasis on music theory. The reason for that is that I thought too much music theory might make the channel a little bit less accessible. Instead, I wanted to focus on this music through more of a historical lens. Now, there are a few songs where I look at a bit of music theory, but I try not to get too technical, and it's usually only as a means of explaining a bit of background about the song. Generally, I like to look more at the history of this music and explain where these songs came from, and particularly how we still hear and experience them today. So, to that end, I decided to pick two distinct dates that had some historical significance to them as a start and end to the era. These would act as a general guide to my channel, but it's not an absolute distinction. The dates I picked were 1844 and 1964. Now, in the other video, I talk more about those two dates and explain why I picked them to bookend this era and style of music. And while I think they make sense, they are also kind of subjective. There are a handful of songs written before 1844 that could probably count as Origipop, and there are even more songs written after 1964, mostly from musicals, but also others, like those of Laufey, that sound quite a bit like Origipop. So, what about those? To answer this question, let's talk a bit about Laufey and her music. Many people, including Laufey herself, describe her music as jazz. And as I was researching her, I came across this video by Adam Neely, Is Laufey Jazz? It's an interesting video where he makes the argument that she isn't technically jazz for a variety of reasons. I won't try to summarize them here. If you're interested though, you should definitely go watch his video. Anyways, he says that her music isn't really jazz, but is more mid-century pop. This term, mid-century pop, is a term he uses that he likens to musical theater and Disney music from that time. I think this term is similar to another term I've come across, traditional pop, which I don't particularly like. I explain why in my other video, but very basically, I reject the idea that the popular music from the middle of the 20th century is substantially different from the popular music of the late 19th and early 20th century. Both still fulfill the requirements I laid out previously in my definition of Origipop. But essentially, if we just use my term, Origipop, in place of his, mid-century pop, he's making the argument that Laufey is Origipop. At least her music is more like that than it is jazz. However, in his discussion of jazz, Adam Neely touches on a few ideas I thought were interesting and that have bearing here. He shares the idea that, quote, genre is more than just the sound of the music. He classifies genre in part as the culture and community of the people making and listening to the music. I like this idea and feel that I would just add that genre can also include the historical context of the music. When I think of Origipop, I'm thinking specifically of a historical genre. Sure, a lot of Laufey music might sound like Origipop. I also think that the music of Alan Menken, composer of numerous Disney films, the wonderful musical Little Shop of Horrors, and the hilarious and terribly underrated musical comedy TV show Galavant, writes music that sounds just like Origipop in many ways. And I love that music. But ultimately, it can't be original popular music because original popular music is in part defined by its historical context. I created the term original popular music in order to give a name to a type of music that I like that existed and was popular a long time ago that doesn't really have a good name to describe it. And so I defined it by a few general characteristics, but also specifically its place in history. And while the dates could be adjusted a bit, overall, I think there's a fundamental historical difference between the original popular music and modern music that just sounds a lot like it. And I like a lot of this modern music that still has those same sounds and characteristics. But the term I created can't really be applied to this more modern music. Origipop is the original popular music. That's specifically what it refers to, the music of the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. But that doesn't mean modern music that sounds like Origipop can't be included somehow in our discussions of Origipop. But how do we classify this music that is so definitely in the Origipop vein and retains so many of the characteristics and the general sound and feel of this early popular music, but is from a more modern era? I want to have a term that both connects this newer music to Origipop, but also makes clear its distinct historical context. A few terms I've been mulling over are contemporary Origipop, or maybe as contradictory as it seems, modern Origipop. Maybe just new original popular music. I'm still not sure. I don't want to call it late or later Origipop, as I'm already thinking about dividing the main Origipop era into 3 sections called early, middle, and late, but I'll discuss that idea in another video. Look, ultimately, none of this really matters too much. Focusing on labels and what genre an artist or type of music is or isn't probably isn't really all that important. Listen to and enjoy the music you like, and who cares what it's called, right? But at the same time, it is nice to have a name and definition for something that you like. It helps us connect to others who know about and like the same thing, and explain what we like to those who don't. Lastly, I just want to make clear and reiterate that these ideas about this type of music and even the term original popular music is something that I just made up that works well for me and guides the content I focus on this channel. If any of you have different ideas about how to classify this music that works well for you, go for it. And let me know in the comments what those ideas are. Just as long as this music isn't forgotten, but has continued to be shared and enjoyed, it doesn't really matter what we call it. Thanks for watching.